Okay. Well, why don't we get started? Hi, everybody. I'm Sam Myers. I'm the director of the Planetary Health Alliance and a principal research scientist here at the School of Public Health. And before we start with the colloquium talk, we have a quick announcement about something that just happened. And I want to introduce my colleague, Jeremy Pivor, who's the senior program coordinator for the Planetary Health Alliance. So, Jeremy, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Sam, and hello, everyone. Thanks for coming today. So just an hour before this event, we wrapped up the launch of the Sao Paulo Declaration on Planetary Health with guest speakers Akam Steiner, Paul Pullman, Hindu Maro Ibrahim, Dr. Nicole DePaula, and Dr. Donald Lee to celebrate the Declaration's publication in The Lancet as of last night. The Sao Paulo Declaration was developed by the global planetary health community with support from the United Nations Development Program, who hosted a global consultation of over 300 people from more than 70 countries. The Declaration's central premise is that humans must make transformational shifts now in how we live in order to optimize the health and well-being of all people and the planet we depend on. It guides people across society with suggested concrete actions for 19 stakeholder groups that support a more just and regenerative post-pandemic world. As of today, over 285 organizations from 47 countries representing more than 19 sectors have endorsed the declaration. These include conservation groups like Wildlife Fund International, medical and public health consortia such as the American Public Health Association and Canadian Medical Association, research and university groups like the Brazilian Academy of Science and Consortia of Universities for Global Health, as well as business coalitions, including the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and Business for Nature. The publication of this declaration in The Lancet is just the first step. We are excited to bring together the 285 signatories into the Alliance network and together brainstorm how to implement the vast array of actions outlined throughout the declaration. We are placing a link to the Lancet article and declaration into the chat now for anyone interested in learning more. You can also find more information at the Planetary Health Alliance website. Thank you, and back to you, Sam.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. So this is a super exciting day for planetary health at Harvard, both because of the launch of the declaration, which was really, really exciting, and definitely invite you all to check it out. And also because this is the opening of this year's Planetary Health Colloquium, which is going to be co-sponsored by the Departments of Environmental Health, Global Health and Population, Nutrition, and Immunology and Infectious Diseases, as well as the Harvard University Center for the Environment and the Harvard Global Health Institute. So it's exciting to have so many different groups coming together to support what's going to be a year-long sort of exploration of this very rapidly emerging and very transdisciplinary field of planetary health, which is focused on understanding the human health effects of our sort of transformation and degradation of our planet's natural systems. I get to introduce our opening speaker, Howie Frumkin. Howie is a physician and epidemiologist. He's a professor emeritus of environmental and occupational health sciences at the University of Washington. And he's just become the senior vice president of the Trust for Public Land, where he's going to be leading that organization's strategic efforts to assemble evidence and drive evidence into policy and practice on its priority areas of health, equity, and climate action. He was previously the head of Our Planet, Our Health at the Wellcome Trust, and also dean of the University of Washington School of Public Health. Before that, he was director of the National Center for Environmental Health at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and professor and chair of environmental and occupational health at Emory University. His career is focused on health aspects of climate change, the built environment, energy policy, nature contact, and sustainability. He's the author or co-author of over 300 scientific journal articles and chapters, as well as 10 books, including, in the past 2 years, 2 books on planetary health. One, Planetary Health Protecting Nature to Protect Ourselves, was published in 2020. And the second, Planetary Health Safeguarding Human Health and the Environment in the Anthropocene, just came out about a month ago. So wonderful to have Howie with us. And when he finishes his sort of introduction to the field of planetary health, Ellen Brandt will be our initial discussant. Alan is the Amelie Moses Cass Professor of the History of Medicine and Professor of the History of Science at Harvard University. He's been there a long time because I was a research assistant for him when I was an undergraduate. And he holds a joint appointment between the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and Harvard Medical School. He served as Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences from 2008 to 2012, earned his undergraduate degree at Brandeis and PhD in American History from Columbia. And his work focuses on social and ethical aspects of health, disease, medical practices, and global health in the 20th century. Alan's the author of No Magic Bullet, A Social History of Venereal Disease in the United States since 1880, and co-editor of Morality and Health in 1997. His book on the social and cultural history of cigarette smoking in the US, The Cigarette Century, The Rise, Fall, and Deadly Persistence of the Product That Defined America, was published by Basic Books in 2007. He's written on the social history of epidemic disease, the history of public health and health policy, and the history of human experimentation, among other topics. I have been in the enviable position of being a student, a mentee, a colleague, and now a friend of both Howie and Alan. And I think that makes me an enormously lucky person. So with that, let me introduce Howie Frumpkin. Howie, you're muted.
Okay, do I have a visible screen and an audible voice? We've got it. Sam, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm really honored to be here. One thing you didn't mention, Sam, is that I am a proud graduate of the department in which this colloquium is taking place. So a special hello to everybody from the department. The title that I'm using is Planetary Health, Environmental Health 4.0. That is with a question mark at the end. I think the advertised title didn't have the question mark. So I want to emphasize that I'm offering this as a proposition, a rebuttable proposition, and we'll have a chance for you to rebut it if you'd like toward the end of the hour. I just want to say what an honor it is to have Alan as a discussant. I'm a great admirer of Alan's work. I did visit Alan's Google author page, or Amazon author page before the talk. It looks like this. And I couldn't help but notice that the first edition of No Magic Bullet is selling for $855. So to Alan, I want to see if I could get a tutorial in book marketing after this colloquium is over. And to everybody on the colloquium, I happen to be the proud owner of the first edition of Alan's book, and I can let you have it for a cool $750, which would be a real bargain. So contact me afterwards if you'd like it. Before continuing, let me acknowledge that although Seattle is my home, where I live and work on unceded traditional land of the Coast Salish people, I'm actually speaking with you today from Philadelphia, the indigenous unceded territory of the Lenape people, also known as the Delaware Indians. I acknowledge the original inhabitants of these lands with gratitude and with respect. What I'd like to do is give you the big picture about planetary health, some conceptual background, and then I'll offer a few examples toward the end, and I think that will take up our 25 minutes. So to begin with the big picture, let me invite you to channel your inner historian and your inner ecologist. I want to introduce 8 key concepts that I think are foundational to planetary health, and those are the concepts listed here. The Great Acceleration, Deep Time, the Anthropocene, planetary boundaries. Oh, I guess they're so important that I'll introduce them twice. The concept of the donut, ecosystem services, and the polycrisis. So the immediate story of the Great Acceleration may begin here in the mid-19th century. This is the bottom of a coal mine in Scotland, and you'll notice that intrepid gentleman bravely lighting his pipe in the presence of probably combustible gases. Or the story may begin here, just about the same time, just before the American Civil War. This is the Drake Well in Pennsylvania, the first large commercial oil well in the United States and maybe anywhere in the world. So we have large-scale coal production underway by this time. We have large-scale oil production beginning, and those things herald a remarkable increase in the use of energy by the people of the world. You can see a little bit of a time lag through the last few decades of the 19th century. But by the 20th century, we're seeing a radical ramp up of energy, most of it comprising the so-called fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. That increase in the use of energy enabled and propelled a number of other changes. This is a picture of population growth of humanity from the end of the last ice age, about 10,000 years, 12,000 years ago, up to the present. Get used to this shape curve. You'll see this a few times in the next couple of minutes. This is a picture of economic activity over the last couple of millennia. You can see that the combination of more readily available energy from fossil fuels and more people led to a ramp up of human economic activity that was remarkable in its trajectory. In fact, by almost any measure of the human enterprise, we've had remarkable accelerations in the last few centuries. Water use, transportation, fertilizer consumption, paper production, plastic production, primary energy use shown here, but we might just as well show you the number of McDonald's outlets or the amount of travel, you name it. The human enterprise has intensified remarkably and rapidly. Now that has led to extraordinary improvements in the human condition. Many have argued that there's never been a better time to be alive and to be human. Illiteracy is dropping, poverty is dropping, child survival is improving, life expectancy is improving, albeit none of these to the extent that we would like, but the human condition has improved dramatically. But before we celebrate that in an unmitigated way, let's remember that these improvements have come at a cost to the planet. And the scale of that cost is mind-boggling to me. I'm going to try to boggle your mind now too by talking a little bit about the context of these changes, both in spatial terms and in temporal terms. So if we were to scale the planet to the size of a soccer ball, the entire biosphere would be about as thick in proportion as a cellophane wrapping. The biosphere is a small and fragile wrapping around our planet. Not only that, if we look at the biomass within that biosphere, you can see on this diagram that plants comprise the vast majority of biomass, and the animal kingdom down there at the bottom right represents less than 1% of biomass on the planet. And if we blow up that animal kingdom representation, we can see that most of it consists of insects. And way down there in the bottom right, there is humanity, less than 1% of the animal kingdom by weight. And interestingly and importantly, outweighed by the livestock that we raise to feed ourselves, but ourselves greatly outweighing all of the rest of mammalian species. So we are a small fraction of life on Earth. Not only that, think about deep time. This is a timeline leading from the formation of the Earth 4 or 5 billion years ago up to the present. And what you can see is that life appeared on Earth around 2 billion years ago. Mammals appeared on Earth around 200 million years ago. Our ancestors, Homo sapiens, appeared about 200,000 years ago. And we only emerged from being hunter-gatherers to live in towns, to write things down, to inflict PowerPoint presentations on each other just 10,000 years ago. So we are a very small part of the story, and we are very late arrivals at the party. And it is remarkable to think that we might have altered conditions of the entire planet, but we have. John McPhee's wonderful quotation, considering the history of life on Earth as the old measure of the English yard, the distance from the king's nose to the tip of his outstretched hand. One stroke of a nail file on his middle finger erases human history. So there's deep time for you. But despite our small mass, despite our late arrival, we have changed the chemistry of the atmosphere. We've changed the chemistry of the oceans. We've changed the temperature of the planet. We've changed the distribution of land uses on a planetary basis. We've changed the species mixes on the planet. We've had a remarkable impact on changing planetary conditions. That observation and the observation that those changes in turn redound to disbenefits for humanity are at the core of planetary health. Now, those changes have led geologists to recognize a new geological epoch, which is called the Anthropocene, marked by the fact that so many Earth systems are heavily influenced by human activity. You've all heard of the Anthropocene. Those observations have also given rise to the notion of planetary limits. This is a classic diagram of planetary limits showing various dimensions on which there may be limits. Climate change, novel entities, meaning the introduction of chemical species to the biosphere, ozone depletion, atmospheric aerosol loading, and so on. The green zone in the center is presumed to be a safe zone, and the red zone is beyond the zone of uncertainty, which is yellow, and may signify irreversible changes that could bring high risk for humans as well as many other species. Now, this is a concept not without controversy. Some people point out that there aren't, in fact, clean lines between what's safe and unsafe, as the picture might suggest. Some people point out that many of these changes play out on a regional scale, not on a planetary or global scale. But the core notion here that there are limits that we should not transgress is a very sound notion. You may also raise a question about this picture in another way, and that is, where are the people? After all, we are a school of public health, not a school of physical sciences. Shouldn't there be people at the center of all this? Well, let's redraw this picture to look like this, the exact same planetary boundaries with what we've now labeled an ecological ceiling, a ceiling above which we shouldn't go. We can place now in what's a vacant center of the circle, a social foundation of human needs, food, water, energy, and many of the other necessities for life. And we should avoid a shortfall. We shouldn't drop below the floor of the social foundation. And so the space in between the ecological ceiling and the social foundation, where we provide for human needs without transgressing planetary boundaries, has been called the safe and just space for humanity, a regenerative and distributive economy. This is the donut economics model put forward by Oxford economist Kate Raworth. And it is a very useful conceptual model for planetary health as well. Now, I do want to acknowledge, and Kate Raworth has personally acknowledged to me, that the donut may not be the best metaphor. After all, donuts are not popular with public health people. Kate did not consult with me before she made up the metaphor, but Andy Haynes and I, who is my co-author of one of the Planetary Health books that Sam was kind enough to mention, have reconceptualized it as life buoy economics, because life buoys are associated with rescue as opposed to donuts being associated with obesity. So this is the picture I present to you of life buoy economics, a riff on Kate Raworth. Now, one of the last concepts I want to introduce foundationally is the concept of ecosystem services. This comes out of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessments, now a few decades old, very useful concept. The notion that services are provided to humanity by life on Earth and by geophysical processes. They're categorized into 4 categories: supporting services, such as the formation of soil; provisioning services, such as the providing to us of food and fresh water; regulating services, such as blunting the impacts of floods through the presence of mangrove swamps in coastal areas; and cultural services, such as the beauty and joy that many of us take from natural ecosystems. We can in turn map each of those categories of ecosystem services to a range of human benefits. This is a very complicated diagram, but the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment breaks those services into the provision of security, basic material for a good life, the foundational elements of health, good social relations, and freedom of choice and action. Now, you don't need to know all of this in detail, but the core concept here of ecosystem services is that intact planetary processes are foundational to human well-being. Can't have healthy people without a healthy planet. So where does that leave us? We are on an altered planet with a number of major system changes, climate change being arguably the best known, but biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, land use changes, altered biogeophysical cycles, depleted fisheries, posing nutritional threats, and so on and so forth. But that's not all. These are the biogeophysical changes that we have to reckon with. But we also confront a number of social and demographic challenges at the same time: a rapidly growing population, aging population, and linkages among different members of those populations through globalization. This is a map of airline routes showing just how much globalization has proceeded. That's no surprise to any of us as we watched over the past couple of years the COVID pandemic spread. We also confront enormous poverty and income inequality, the concentration of wealth in a smaller and smaller proportion of the global population, and persistent racism and discrimination. We also confront an intellectual environment, if you will, of prominent disinformation, of populist movements around the world, and of the rise of numerous authoritarian governments, too often elected. And on the biomedical and public health side, we face problems of infectious diseases as well as non-communicable diseases, and diminishing social connectedness with the rise of loneliness as a recognized problem. So the challenges we face are multiple, and they don't exist in silos. They interact with each other, as suggested by this now iconic photo of a COVID warning mask about to burn up in one of California's recent wildfires. These are interacting problems, such that the diagrammatic depiction of these problems, the polycrisis as it's been called, might look something like this: a web of interacting problems, requiring that we truly be systems thinkers as we attempt to optimize health in the context of these multiple challenges. And the last point I want to make foundationally has to do with timing. This is a picture of biodiversity loss rapidly accelerating, and it's the time course of the change that I want you to notice. Rapid loss of species in each of these categories. This is a picture of insect population declines over recent decades, extraordinarily rapid declines. Antarctic sea ice loss is rapidly accelerating. Glacier loss is rapidly accelerating. Weather-related catastrophes are rapidly mounting at an accelerating pace. We're getting closer and closer to tipping points beyond which irreversible fundamental changes in Earth systems may well occur. And some of the ones that are pictured here are the Atlantic circulation, the glacial cover, the Antarctic and the Arctic sea ice, and so on. And the last piece of timing that I want to mention is shown here. This is a picture of multiple pathways to get to where we would limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Each of the different colored lines signifies a different pathway based on different assumptions of technology development, population growth, economic arrangements, and so on. But the key point here is that every one of these pathways to get to 1.5 degrees assumes dramatic carbon dioxide emissions reductions starting now. And we know that's not happening. Emissions continue to rise, not fall. So this litany of rapid acceleration in negative changes in Earth systems and the urgency of taking action all spell one word, and we in the health sciences know this word quite well. We're in an emergency situation. So this is enough truly to drive a person to despair. And it calls for, among other things, new paradigms in science. And this is where planetary health comes in. There was a manifesto issued in 2014, and the Planetary Health Commission published its report in 2015. Sam was a member of that commission. Out of that was born the Planetary Health Alliance. That has been followed in the last few years by the birth of a number of academic units around the world, including many in the global south. Extraordinarily rapid emergence of this field. And we now have a couple of textbooks available in the field as well. So it is at the point where it is a thing now. It is a field, and it's emerging very rapidly. Planetary health is defined in a number of ways. This is the definition that comes out of the Rockefeller Lancet Commission. And I'll just call your attention to the fact that it includes both human systems and natural systems, and is summarized briefly as the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems on which it depends. When I'm asked to characterize planetary health, to me, the most important characteristics are the ones shown here. It is people-centered. So although it's got a strong grounding in Earth, atmospheric sciences, ecology, it's people-centered. It is systems-based, as I tried to suggest by showing those complicated polycrisis diagrams. It's upstream facing, meaning that we look at root causes and not just at the biomedical outcomes. It is committed to equity on a global scale and within societies. It is future-oriented and solutions-driven, meaning that we need to be asking questions about the trajectory of current changes, what the impacts are likely to be, and how we can interrupt those changes to protect people. And it is hopeful, because being solutions-driven and demonstrating the discovery and implementation of solutions is itself a way to propel hope. So this is why I like to think of planetary health perhaps as environmental health 4.0, the origins of the field in the 19th century and sanitary engineering and industrial medicine, the rise of toxicology and epidemiology in the second half of the 20th century, triggered by Silent Spring and similar works, the rise of the environmental justice movement as environmental health 3.0, the fact that equity and fairness became central to the field, and now the notion of planetary health grounding the work we do in the earth and atmospheric sciences and in ecology, and truly aspiring to be systems thinkers. So let me work a couple of quick examples and then turn the floor over to Alan. Examples can be drawn from the most elemental parts of our lives: the energy we use, the stuff we consume, the places we inhabit, the food we eat. And I'll just have time for a couple of examples that I'll try to work relatively quickly. The first will come from the energy field. I'd like to talk about dams. How do we think about dams? Well, dams on the face of it are a good thing. This is a picture of the greenhouse gas emissions profiles of various electricity sources. And you can see that hydroelectric power is one of the cleanest sources of power we have. If we get our electricity through burning fossil fuels, we inflict all kinds of damage on the planet and on each other. If we get our electricity from hydro, that has real advantages. And this has not been lost on anybody. Many of the world's major river systems are built out with dams. This is the Columbia River Basin where I live. And each of those yellow and red dots represents a dam. This is a fully dammed river system, to the point that activists are clamoring to take down some of these dams to protect salmon at this point. Dam construction is undergoing a global boom right now. There are under 3 million dams in the world, of which over 50,000 are large dams. Only 3,500 of them are operating hydroelectric dams, but that number is set to double in coming years. Around 2/3 of the world's rivers have been dammed now. There aren't that many free-flowing rivers left, and there are plans underway to dam many of those. You can see here the purple dots represent operational dams in Asia on the left, in South America on the right. The red and yellow dots outnumber the purple dots. Those are dams under construction or planned. So we're in a dam building boom. Dams are complicated things. They come with trade-offs. This is a great example, the Three Gorges Dam. It supplants around 20 coal-fired power plants. That's a good thing. It displaced 1.25 million people. And we now have a fairly robust body of scholarship indicating that that displacement came with a number of health costs, mental health costs. In fact, in general, dams are both good and bad for human health. They provide clean electricity, dependable water, irrigation, flood control, recreational opportunities. It has to be said that many of those benefits may diminish in coming years as hydrology changes with climate change and as there is less water behind many of those dams. But dams also bring risks, and the risks are listed here on the right. The changes in river hydrology, which in the case of my part of the world, risk salmon flows, which are culturally very valuable for the tribes who live in our areas. Altered fluxes of a number of elements, methane emissions from the waters that are impounded behind dams, toxin formation, infectious disease risks, population displacement, and so on. So this is an example of the complex thinking that is needed to reckon fully with a apparently simple and seemingly good solution of dams. And that complexity and that reckoning with trade-offs is an important part of the planetary health research agenda. Second example is the challenge of nuts. Now, our nutritional colleagues have done a lot of work looking at nuts. They've tested the hypothesis that nut consumption is good for human health. And in fact, nut consumption is pretty good for human health. There's a robust body of literature, mostly focusing on cardiovascular outcomes, on the microbiome, subdivided into the various kinds of nuts that are available. And you can imagine the conventional public health research agenda that emerges from these initial observations. What is it about nuts that are healthy? And can we take advantage of that to craft even healthier nuts? How much nut consumption should we recommend for people? How do we persuade non-nut lovers to eat nuts? So these are standard biomedical public health questions, but there's a kind of question that a planetary health person might be inspired to ask, and that is, where do nuts come from? Well, everybody knows the answer to that. It's obvious. They come from convenience stores in little bags, and you buy them as you're standing online waiting to check out. But if you were to follow the nut stream upstream, you might find yourself at an almond orchard that looks like this one, or at a walnut orchard that looks like this one. And chances are you would be in one of just a couple of places. For almonds, 3/4 of the world's almonds are grown in the United States. For walnuts, about a half in China, more than a quarter in the US, and the balance in other places. So let's focus on nut production in the US. Where does it take place? Well, that's what these maps show. Almonds on the left, walnuts on the right. You can see that almost all of the nut production occurs for both kinds of nuts in the Central Valley of California, where nuts are a very important product economically. I didn't know this, but almonds surpass grapes as California's top value crop. Tree nuts are California's #1 agricultural export, 6 times greater than California wine. Nuts are big business for California. Well, what do we think about that? Nuts are very water consumptive food to produce. You can see on this picture that nuts are second only to beef as a water requiring food to produce. And that fact would seem to collide with the contemporary reality in California. California has increasingly been a dry state. It's been in a prolonged drought in recent years. And that's not something that's going away anytime soon. We know that the future has in store for California more chaotic weather extremes, meaning less reliable rainfall. Farmers need reliable rainfall to grow what they grow, more severe droughts, and less water from snow melt. Not only that, nuts are a fairly heavy pesticide using crop to grow. This is a picture from California's tracking program showing the levels of pesticide use in the California counties where nuts are grown. And you can see that nut production requires a fairly heavy dose of pesticides.
Hey, Howie, sorry to interrupt. We should wrap up the next few minutes, ideally.
Perfect, Sam. I'm on the home stretch now.
All right.
Projections are that climate change will likely increase pesticide use requirements. And so all of this is on a collision course in California. It's not a simple matter simply to say, eat more nuts, because in the context of planetary changes, if we combine the thinking of agriculture and hydrology and climate projections and nutrition, we come up with very tough dilemmas. And again, researchable questions on how to optimize the many different elements of planetary health. Last example, very quickly, and then I'll wrap up. And I'm going to come back to dams. This is the Diama Dam in Senegal, not a very big dam, 18 meters high, but high enough to impound river water behind it and to prevent seawater from washing back upstream with tidal movement. That impoundment of river water created a perfect habitat for snails. And snails, as you may recall, are an intermediate host for the schistosome organism that is the cause of schistosomiasis. Sure enough, after the dam was built in the mid-1980s, schistosomiasis exploded along the sides of the river, but a brilliant solution was found, and that solution was prawns. It turns out that if you colonize the river with prawns, they eat the snails. Schistosomiasis rates come down. You also provide a dietary protein source for the people who live there, and you provide a cash crop for the people who live there, exemplifying the solutions orientation of planetary health. The fact that if you bring together economics, cultural anthropology, river ecology, human health, you can develop solutions that are sustainable and healthy. So the lessons that come from this research are, don't just focus on one issue, don't just solve one problem, and never just think in the present tense. And I'm going to skip through this and just summarized by repeating that planetary health as a scientific framework and as a paradigm features the attributes that are shown here, offers great promise for solving many of the most pressing and complex challenges we face in the world today. So thanks, Sam, thanks for not only the kind introduction, but the very gentle reminder that time was up. And Alan, I'll pass the microphone to you.
Thanks so much, Howie. This was just a great presentation, and I'm enormously grateful to you because I think in a relatively brief time, you have synthesized and put together this wide conceptual foundation for pretty radically rethinking health through the lens of planetary health. And that is really just fantastic. And I sort of imagine people listening to this that you've been so persuasive and the examples are so telling that all of us would say, yes, let's do this. Let's become involved. Let's do this kind of work that has these kinds of implications. So the question that I really want to raise is, if we all would agree, and of course, we have a biased sample in our Zoom room today of a certain sociodemographic, educated, probably progressive, and I don't want to stereotype our group, but we're part of major academic institutions. And I guess the thing that I'm so struck about when we talk about paradigm change is that there's so much consensus that we are in an emergency, that these changes are accelerating, that they're a threat to all of us. And yet the obstacles to making the conceptual, intellectual, and institutional changes are really pretty considerable. And so the question in a sense is, we have this game-changing, paradigmatic orientation to systematic research intervention and radical reconstruction of how humans live on Earth. That's so necessary. The signs are all around us that we must do this. And yet, certainly at the wider socio-political level, this has been enormously difficult. And we know some of those reasons. There are incredibly powerful economic and industrial interests that prefer to maintain this state of affairs despite the implications for the future. And so that I sort of, I think we know we could develop certain kinds of, political and social strategies to try to address that. But I have to say, one thing I know as a historian, things don't only get better, they sometimes get worse. And we're living through a phase of enormous divisiveness and radical disparities of wealth and interest that may inhibit our ability to really invoke and implement this orientation to health. But I think the thing that has surprised me, and we might focus on this to some degree, is it's incredibly difficult within our elite institutions of academia, learning, intellect, research. And you go around and you say, we need to really radically rethink this given the character of the emergency for our planet and the future of our health. But the kinds of responses we might get are, well, we're already doing that. This is a characteristic response. We have a lot going on in the environmental and climate areas and in studying nutrition and, and the biome. And so, I'm not clear, about what the difference is from what I already think we're committed to. So that would be one question. Or then you're told, well, we tried that and it didn't work, or you can't do that here. And so I'd been a sort of observer of the university, this university, Harvard in particular. And some of these reflections are based on my identity as a historian of science. What really leads to sharp, paradigmatic disruption in our sciences and in other fields of inquiry? And then the other one is, what are the characteristics of the way we have organized universities? And how do those end up serving as an obstacle to the very problems we most want to solve? And I really reflected on this when I was dean of the graduate school, because I sort of realized that a lot of the interests of students did not conform to the organization of our departments and PhD programs. And I started to ask, like, well, when did we organize the university in this way? And it turns out kind of late 19th, early 20th century. That's when we established these departments, these ways of knowing, these approaches. And if I had any observation of universities through the course of the 20th century into the 21st, is that they've only become more highly specialized, subdivided, disciplinary oriented. And while there's a lot of lip service to transformational, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary investigation and looking for connections across the disciplinary approaches of our fields, in reality, our institutions are a major drag on reconceptualizing problems and how they can be investigated. So when you said at the end, one issue, one problem, present tense, and that's a critique, it's also a description of most of the work that we're encouraged to do, that we're rewarded for doing, and that constitutes, in many cases, our professional identities. So I guess one of the things I want to draw attention to is just how radical this is. And I want to take one of the characteristics of planetary health, which is hopefulness. But in order to change this, we have to rethink the set of relationships we build in universities. And we have to be, I think, much more explicit about that than we can. I've been briefly leading the university-wide global health program, and I've gotten some of the similar responses that I sort of caricatured, at the outset, which is, well, we have a school of public health. Why do we need a university global health initiative? Or, we have a medical humanities program, isn't that global health? And it's very hard. And I think this is what's been so impressive about this first decade or two of planetary health, to build a community that really can begin to push our institutions aggressively and quickly to reconsider how we've put this together. One last question, I find that I talk to undergraduates and they have not yet fully acculturated the departmental disciplinary orientation that we will ultimately often impose on them. And that's very exciting. It's one of the reasons I like teaching college level students. And they would come to me as they do, and they're earnest and they're highly motivated and passionate. I want to do something about this crisis on our planet. What should I do? And it's frustrating to me because, they might go do earth and planetary sciences, or they might get a PhD in epidemiology, or they might go to medical school, or they might want to understand the aesthetics of nature. And yet the ability to sort of bring them within a systematic and cohesive, collaborative enterprise is very hard. And quite frankly, in many ways, disable our capacity to engender the incredible persuasive orientation to thinking about health problems that you've laid out. So I have other thoughts, but I think I'll stop there. But it's very challenging. It's very frustrating. And I guess I would say I hope that the anxiety and frustration that your presentation elicited in me can be turned into the kind of, aggressive motivation for change that really underlies everything you said.
Thank you, Alan. Brilliant. Sam, how would you like to proceed? I can respond to Alan, but I'm mindful that we only have about 15 minutes left, and there may be some questions from the audience that you'd rather move directly to addressing.
We do have a couple of questions, but why don't you take a minute or two just to sort of reflect on what Alan was saying, and then I can frame one or two questions that are coming from the audience.
Okay, well, Alan, absolutely brilliant comments. I really appreciate it. What I'd like to respond to, I think, is your analysis of what are some of the barriers within the university environment to tackling the broad challenges of planetary health. And I agree with your analysis completely. I think the presence of disciplinary walls is really a barrier. Everybody says we should be interdisciplinary, but it happens more in the breach than in reality. It's amazing how many distinguished professors actually come to believe that reality is organized according to academic disciplines. It's not. There are alternative models, organizing universities around problem solving rather than around disciplines, and that leads to very interesting academic structures. And even if you don't reorganize the entire university that way, to layer that sort of an approach on top of existing departments, and I think that's partly what the Planetary Health Alliance is doing at Harvard, can be a very productive thing to do. There's another barrier that was implicit in what you said, Alan, but you didn't actually name it. I'll do that, and that is the sacred place that sober objectivity has in academia. Crowding out passion and commitment, crowding out explicit embrace of hope and of aspiration. All of us are kind of conditioned to be measured in the way we talk. We need courage, we need passion. I mean, this is one of those moments when it's all hands on deck, not just to do our jobs as usual. And we need to allow ourselves to be driven by different ways of knowing and by different ways of feeling and motivating our actions accordingly. You mentioned the problem of special interests. It's a real problem. One of the reasons for hope, which I mentioned briefly in my previous comment, is the phenomenal growth of activism, largely among young people in recent years. It would have been difficult to conceive 10 years ago of Harvard divesting from fossil fuels, but look what happened. So I think special interests can be challenged, and I think activists are doing that, and that is moving things around the world, and that's a great source of hope and progress. And then the last, and I want to especially address the School of Public Health, is the problem of soft money. I just want to express sympathy for that dilemma. If you're busy counting your minutes and trying to raise every dollar to support what you do, that can tend to eclipse aspirational and creative thinking. And it's an unfortunate reality, and I no easy solution to that, but at least to name it as a problem, to recognize it, and then to encourage the development of as many mechanisms as possible to free up the very, very good faculty members who would like to do this work to be able to pursue it, even if it's outside the immediate constraints of fundability.
So it looks like we're a little short on time. I want to frame one more question for you, Howie, that jumps off a question from the audience. So you offered this provocative title, Environmental Health 4.0 question mark. And there's been a lot of discussion. Alan was talking about the need to rethink our relationships within the university. There's been a lot of talk about sort of process. And there's a question that we got that says, Howie, great talk. Thank you. My question is, what would you suggest to faculty now doing their thing, maybe epidemiology, lab science, exposure assessment? How do they turn their work towards planetary health? Or are new faculty needed that either add another piece or who are at critical systems interfaces? And so it's sort of the same question about how do we, in a department, in a school, across the university, how do we engage with this topic? Because it feels like it's bigger than any one of us. If it's truly by definition systems thinking and has to be interdisciplinary, then it clearly has to involve a lot of collaboration. So what is your advice to, I think, both individual scholars, but also communities of scholars about how to actually do this kind of scholarship?
Boy, great question. I'm not sure I have any easy answer to that at all, or even the wisdom that it would take to have an answer. But I will say that if you take as your starting point, what's the world you'd like to see? What's the problem you'd like to solve? Rather than, and I'm going to caricature and overstate a little bit for the sake of clarity, what's interesting to me? What's fundable? These are not unusual starting points for academic endeavors. But if you displace those and you say, what does the world really need? And in 50 years, when I'm lying in my deathbed, toothless, and reflecting back over my life, what would I like to be able to say I helped bring about? This is really a kind of an existential framing of what we want our work, the ways in which we want our work to be meaningful and consequential. And I think interrogating all of our work against criteria like those, and not doing that as a private venture, but talking with other faculty from other parts of the university to reason through those questions together. I think, this, like anything big and worthwhile, this is a group effort, and it requires multidisciplinarity. So what are the big questions we need to be tackling to have the most meaningful contributions? How do we do this in as broad-based a way as possible, which will imply interdisciplinary, which will require systems thinking, which will get us closer to the right answers? Maybe somewhere in that complex of thoughts are some thoughts about how to proceed.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Howie and Alan. I want to take this moment to celebrate the fact that this is the beginning, not the end, and that in fact, I think a lot of the questions that have been raised today, and I appreciate you, Howie, for raising more questions maybe than you answered, which is perfectly appropriate as the first talk in a long series. And I think that what's exciting is the following talks will have a slightly different quality to them. We're going to really dig into some of the core research across different dimensions of health. And so every first Wednesday of the month for the rest of the academic year, we will have talks. The next one will be Caroline Buckey from Global Health and Population, talking about the book she's working on around artisanal gold mining in Guyana and exposure to malaria, leishmaniasis, and dengue related to land use changes, but also the story of how mercury is escaping from those mines and entering waterways and being bioaccumulated in fish, which then when consumed cause neurocognitive declines in the people who eat the fish. And so it's a sort of a classic planetary health story that she's working on in her Radcliffe Fellowship. And interestingly, Sana Sokolov, whose research Howie just cited in West Africa around the Diama Dam, will be the discussant for that conversation about land use and infectious disease. We'll follow that with a conversation about nutrition and the story of how insufficient pollinating insects around the world can be connected with their global health impacts. And Frank Hughes offered to be a discussant for that conversation. So what we're going to be doing is sort of moving across different dimensions of health, from infectious disease to nutrition to mental health to heat exposure and conflict, and actually seeing how this work is done. And I think it will maybe help to answer some of these questions about how do we come together with our particular talents, none of which are the whole story, and how do we find, our partners so that we can actually do this kind of rigorous interdisciplinary research, and what does that actually look like? And so I think as the colloquium unfolds, we'll get a much clearer sense of the possibilities when we are able to cross our disciplinary boundaries and work together. And then hopefully the last couple of talks will actually be a bit of a pivot from really exploring the science and the research to asking, how are the knowledge and the frameworks that are coming out of all of this science and this scholarship actually moving out into the real world to affect decision making? And I'm hoping that we'll hear from some global policy makers and maybe business leaders about how planetary health is a framework that's really influencing action in the real world. So we haven't lined up all of those talks yet. We still have a little bit of homework to do, but it should be a really fun experience, and hopefully all of you will be able to join us going forward. Alan, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts or reflections, or Howie, but we have a couple more minutes.
I guess I would just say I want to thank you and Howie, because it's very important for us to be rethinking how to solve, these enormous problems. And we have seen a long phase where the strategy of doing research was about getting down to a single variable in a disciplinary way. And I think that kind of work will obviously continue and is important. But making these linkages, thinking systematically, is going to be just crucial. So I feel like I asked some hard questions that have frustrated me, but at the same time, I hope this group will become, a foundation for thinking critically about how to change the institutions that we work in.
And I would just say, I didn't mention this earlier, but I spent some time at Harvard last year looking at some of the Planetary Health foundational resources, mostly human resources. And there is amazing capacity and amazing commitment and interest there. So Sam, a salute to you for your leadership. Thanks to you for all you've taught me. And to everybody, I would just say we should close on a note of hope. There are solutions to many of these problems. I close on a note of passion and aspiration and commitment. This is fun work to do. The people who are drawn to do this work are fun people to work with. It's consequential work that makes a difference. So I say, be brave, have fortitude, go out and make good trouble, and stick with Planetary Health. Thank you very much for the chance to be part of the colloquium.
Thank you, Howie. What a wonderful note to close on. And thank you all for joining us. We'll hope to see you the first Wednesday in November for Caroline Bucky's talk at the same time. All right. Goodbye, everybody.